The meeting was supposed to be routine. Instead, it became the moment 18 years of my work were erased in under 60 seconds. No warning, no process, no legal review. Just a decision made by a CEO who believed people were as interchangeable as the charts he liked to present. What no one in that room realized was that this wasn't just a termination, it was the beginning of a chain reaction that would unravel everything he thought he controlled. Before we continue, please take a moment to like and subscribe to the channel, but only if you genuinely enjoy it. And please let me know where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. I'll read all the comments. Okay, now I'll continue. Vance Hollowell had been CEO for just over 3 months. Long enough to talk about efficiency optimization and fresh talent. Not long enough to understand what actually kept the company running. My name is Tara Dean. I was the Director of Crisis Operations, the person responsible for 72% of our enterprise clients, the one they called when deals worth millions were seconds from collapsing. To him, I was just another cost line. So when the board finished reviewing the numbers, and the room settled into that familiar corporate silence, he decided it was the perfect moment. He didn't hesitate. He didn't even look at the legal counsel. Let's be honest, you've been holding this company back. Pack your things and don't slow us down on your way out. No one laughed, no one agreed, but no one stopped him either. I felt the weight of every eye in the room, and then nothing at all. No anger, no panic, just a quiet stillness. I closed my laptop, aligned the documents in front of me, and spoke once. I'll need that decision in writing. He nodded, almost amused. The email arrived before I reached the elevator. That was the moment it stopped being a termination and became a liability, because buried in the contract he had just ignored was a clause that didn't disappear when I was fired, it activated. And by the time Vance Hollowell understood what he had done, the board wasn't questioning my absence. They were questioning his judgment. I want to make it clear to you all. The story you are listening to is a blend of real-life workplace situations with fictional elements using artificial intelligence to deepen the emotional experience and convey the message. I hope it resonates with you, and if not, that's okay too. Get some good rest and take good care of yourself. 18 years is a long time to become invisible. I built the crisis response system from scratch, long before it had a name, before it became a line item in a budget presentation. What started as a late-night favor for a failing client turned into a framework that now protected over 72% of our enterprise accounts, generating nearly $480 million a year. There were no manuals for it, no complete documentation, just patterns, instincts, and a set of unwritten protocols I carried in my head. For years, that made me valuable. Then, Vance Hollowell arrived. He didn't ask how the system worked. He looked at a dashboard, saw response times, cost ratios, staffing numbers, and decided what mattered. To him, I wasn't the system. I was an expense attached to it. Operational overhead, he called me in one meeting, like I was a rounding error. The credit shifted quickly after that. What I had built over nearly 2 decades was rebranded as part of a new AI initiative. Slides were updated, reports rewritten, my name disappeared. And then came Emily Shaw, 24. Confident. Impressive on paper. My replacement. We don't need instincts, Vance said, gesturing toward the screen. We have metrics. I nodded like it made sense, because arguing would have required explaining something he had already decided to ignore. What he didn't realize, what none of them did, was that the system they believed in didn't actually exist without me. It only looked like it did. I didn't go home after the meeting. I went back to my desk, opened my laptop, and read my contract again, slowly this time. The numbness hadn't worn off yet, but something else was starting to surface beneath it. Not anger, not even frustration, just clarity. Buried in the termination section was a clause most executives never paid attention to. Improper termination didn't just create legal exposure, it delayed operational separation. For 30 days, I retained system visibility and limited access, while the company assumed full liability for any breakdowns tied to decisions made without proper transition. Vance hadn't just fired me, he had removed himself from protection. I read that paragraph twice, then a third time, making sure I wasn't interpreting it the way I wanted to. I wasn't. Then I opened a new email. Per your directive, effective immediately, I will no longer engage with or support any operations related to U.S. clients. All communications escalations and responsibilities will be handled exclusively by your newly assigned leadership. I copied Vance. I copied the board. I kept the language clean, neutral, compliant. Then I hit send. That was the moment the system changed. Not because I broke anything, because I stopped holding it together. Over the next hour, I transferred active threads, redirected contacts, and removed myself from every escalation loop tied to the U.S. market. No commentary, no warnings, just execution. Malicious compliance didn't feel dramatic. It felt precise. I followed every instruction exactly as given. And for the first time in 18 years, when a notification flashed on my screen, urgent, unresolved, escalating, I didn't respond. I watched it. Then another came in. And another. That was when it became obvious. I didn't need to act. Standing still was enough. The transition began the next morning, exactly as instructed. I treated it like any other handoff, structured, complete, and professionally detached. 126 active clients each, with their own history, risk profile, and unspoken expectations. I documented what could be documented, summarized what could be summarized, and transferred every account to Emily Shaw. Names, timelines, open issues, escalation patterns, all neatly organized in the system. What I didn't include were the things that had never been written down. The judgment calls, the early warning signs, the small adjustments made at exactly the right moment to prevent something bigger from breaking. Those had always lived with me. By midday, every thread was reassigned, every calendar entry updated, every direct line rerouted. I removed myself from escalation channels and internal alerts tied to U.S. operations. No commentary, no resistance, just compliance. Emily walked into my office just before I logged off. I've reviewed the accounts, she said, confident, almost rehearsed. There's a lot of inefficiency here. I'll optimize everything. I looked at her for a moment, then nodded once. Of course. She took that as agreement. It wasn't. By the end of the day, the system looked clean, organized, efficient even, exactly the way Vance wanted it. And for the first time in years, my inbox was quiet. But silence in this job had never meant stability. It meant delay. The first signal came in just after closing an unresolved ticket marked low priority, something that normally would have been handled within minutes. It sat untouched. Then a scheduling conflict. Minor. Easy to miss. Then a delayed response from a client who never waited. Individually, none of it mattered. Together, they formed a pattern. I didn't intervene. I didn't flag it. I simply watched the system continue exactly as it had been instructed to run. Clean, efficient, and just slightly off. Enough that over time it wouldn't correct itself. It would drift. The cracks didn't appear all at once. They surfaced quietly, then all at once. 72 hours after the handoff, the pattern I had seen forming began to show itself in numbers. 11 client inquiries sat unanswered past their response windows. 3 scheduled meetings were missed entirely, no notice, no follow-up. On paper, they looked like small failures. In reality, they were signals. Clients like ours didn't tolerate silence. My inbox reflected it. Messages marked urgent. Then escalated. Then forwarded again with shorter sentences and sharper tone. I didn't reply. I forwarded everything to Emily, copying Vance and the board exactly as before. No commentary, just visibility. By the 4th day, my phone rang. Emily. I let it ring once before answering. Hey, she started, her voice tight under the surface. I just wanted to run something by you, a client situation. How would you usually handle? I cut in gently before she could finish. I don't think it would be appropriate for me to advise, I said. I don't want to violate CEO instructions. There was a pause. Not long, but long enough. I'm not asking you to interfere, she said quickly. Just perspective. I understand, I replied calm and even, but I've been directed not to engage. Silence again. Then the call ended. An hour later, Vance sent a brief message to the leadership group reaffirming his position. Emily was in charge of U.S. operations. All support should be routed through her. No exceptions. He was doubling down. By the end of the week, the tone shifted. One of our largest clients, worth nearly $50 million annually, sent a formal notice. Not a complaint, not a question, a warning. Response failures, missed obligations, potential breach of service terms. It was addressed to Vance. Copied to the board. I read it once, then closed the email. The system hadn't broken yet. But it had been noticed. If you agree with how I handled this, sticking strictly to the CEO's orders and refusing to interfere, then drop a 1 in the comments. Sometimes the most powerful move isn't to fight, it's to follow instructions exactly. Pressure didn't arrive as a single event. It built layer by layer until the system could no longer hide it. By the start of the second week, the numbers stopped looking like isolated issues. Service-level agreements were being breached across multiple accounts, response times, slipping escalation windows, missed resolution delays stacking on top of each other. What had been minor cracks were now visible fractures. And clients were noticing. Internal reports flagged over $27 million in contracts at risk. Not projected loss, active exposure. Accounts that required immediate stabilization were sitting in queue unresolved because the patterns guiding those decisions were no longer being applied. Emily was still trying to keep up. I could see it in the system logs, late updates, rushed notes, inconsistent prioritization. She wasn't incompetent. She was overwhelmed. There's a difference. Vance, however, remained confident. His updates to the board emphasized transition adjustments and temporary inefficiencies. He framed the situation as expected friction, manageable. But the data didn't support that narrative. By midweek, the board began asking questions. Not directly to me, I was no longer in that chain, but through audit requests, copied threads, quiet escalations. They were starting to see what the system actually looked like without intervention. I stayed exactly where I was. Visible, accessible, compliant, and silent. Every alert that crossed my screen followed the same path, forwarded, documented, left untouched. I didn't interpret. I didn't advise. I didn't step in. Legal silence. That was the position. Then the message came in. Not from operations, not from support, from legal. One of our largest clients had issued formal notice of intent to pursue action for breach of service obligations, repeated failures, documented delays, financial impact. The language was precise, deliberate. They weren't asking for answers anymore. They were preparing consequences. I read it once, then closed the file. The system wasn't failing. It was being measured. The emergency meeting was called before the end of the week, and for the first time since my termination, the system wasn't the only thing under pressure. The boardroom filled quickly, not with routine updates or polished presentations, but with urgency. Legal was present, compliance was present. Even directors who rarely attended operational reviews were there asking for numbers that couldn't be softened. I wasn't in the room, but I didn't need to be. Every document, every thread, every escalation was already there, laid out in a timeline no one could ignore. It started with the service failures, then the contract exposure, then the legal notice, and then, finally, the question that shifted everything. Who approved this? Silence followed. Not the controlled silence of a meeting in progress, but the kind that comes when everyone realizes the answer is already known. Vance tried to respond. He reframed the decision, called it a strategic restructure, emphasized long-term efficiency. But the board wasn't listening to projections anymore. They were looking at documentation, at the termination, at the missing notice, at the absence of HR, at the clause he hadn't read. One of the directors asked for the communication trail. It was pulled up immediately. My email sat there unchanged, time-stamped, copied to the board itself. Per your directive, I will not engage with U.S. operations. No interpretation, no deviation, just compliance. They read it in silence. Then someone from legal spoke carefully, like choosing each word mattered. She followed instruction. Another pause. Longer this time, because the implication was clear. If I had followed instruction, then the failure wasn't operational. It was executive. Vance shifted in his seat. For the first time, there was no confidence in his voice when he tried to explain. The language changed, less certainty, more defense. He pointed to transition complexity, to unexpected variables, to the learning curve of new leadership, but none of it addressed the core issue. The termination itself. Improper, unprotected, and now exposed. The legal risk wasn't theoretical anymore. It was active, documented, and tied directly to a decision made in that very room. No one interrupted him this time. They just listened. And the silence that followed wasn't neutral. It was recognition. Because the system hadn't failed on its own. It had been disconnected. And the responsibility had just found its way back to the one person who thought he was in control. The call came late, just as the pressure inside their system reached the point where it could no longer be contained. I recognized the number immediately. Vance Hollowell. I let it ring twice before answering. There was no introduction, no attempt at composure. Come back. Fix this. Not a request. Not an apology. Just an order delivered with urgency instead of authority. I leaned back in my chair, letting the silence stretch for a second longer than necessary. I don't work there anymore, I said. The shift on the other end was immediate. His tone hardened. You're still under contract. Don't play games with me, Tara. This situation is escalating and you're responsible for— No? I interrupted, calm and precise. I'm not. He exhaled sharply, frustration breaking through. You built this system. You know how it works. If you don't step in, this turns into something much bigger. It already has, I replied. Another pause. This one heavier. Then the threat came. If you don't cooperate, we'll pursue legal action. You can't just walk away from this. I almost smiled. You already broke the contract. Silence. Not confusion. Not denial. Recognition. Because he knew exactly what I meant. The improper termination. The missing notice. The clause he had ignored. Every protection he thought he had gone the moment he made that decision in the boardroom. You're still obligated to act in good faith. He tried again, but the edge was gone now. I am, I said evenly. I followed every instruction you gave me. That was the part he couldn't argue with. I could hear movement on his end papers, shifting voices in the background, someone asking a question he didn't answer. The chaos hadn't stopped. It had only moved closer to him. I can make this right, he said finally, quieter now. We'll restore your position. Compensation, title, whatever you need. Just come back and stabilize things. I looked at the contract offer open on my screen. Not from him, from one of his largest clients. They had been watching everything unfold. I've already moved on, I said. He didn't respond right away, because for the first time he understood. He wasn't calling someone he controlled. He was asking someone who no longer needed him. Collapse doesn't always look like an explosion. Sometimes it looks like a slow, measurable transfer of trust. In the weeks after Vance's call, the shift became undeniable. It didn't start with announcements or headlines. It started with quiet emails from clients I had worked with for years. Questions at first, then requests, then offers. Within the first month, 60% of the U.S. clients I had managed moved their contracts to me. Not out of loyalty alone, but because they needed stability and they knew exactly where to find it. By the end of the second month, that number reached 85%. The system they thought could replace me had nothing left to support. Inside the company, the damage followed quickly. Without consistent crisis response, minor issues escalated into major failures. Service guarantees were missed, renewal negotiations stalled, revenue projections dropped, then revised downward again. What had once been their strongest operational unit, the one responsible for nearly $500 million annually, was now a liability they couldn't contain. Emily didn't last. I heard about it through a former colleague. No announcement, no acknowledgement. Just a quiet removal, the same way they had handled everything else, once it became inconvenient. She had been placed in a position she was never prepared for, then left to absorb the consequences. But the real shift happened at the top. The board had delayed action at first, hoping the situation could be stabilized, that the losses would level out, that leadership could recover control. It didn't. Financial reports told a different story. Legal exposure increased, client attrition continued, and every document pointed back to the same decision, the one made in that boardroom. The vote wasn't dramatic. It didn't need to be. Vance Hollowell was removed as CEO before the end of the quarter. No speech, no defense, just a resolution passed and recorded. By the time it happened, the outcome had already been decided. Because once the system lost its foundation, there was no version of events where it rebuilt itself fast enough to matter. By the time everything settled, there was no dramatic ending, just a quiet shift that no one could undo. Vance Hollowell was no longer CEO. There was no announcement filled with corporate language, no carefully staged transition. Just a brief internal notice confirming what everyone already knew. The board had made its decision, and for once it was based on reality instead of projection. The same room that had stayed silent when I was dismissed had finally acted only after the consequences became impossible to ignore. I didn't stay to watch it unfold. I had already built something of my own. Starting over didn't feel like revenge. It felt like alignment. Within a few weeks, I brought in 7 consultants people who understood pressure, who didn't rely on dashboards to tell them when something was wrong. We built slowly, deliberately, focusing on precision instead of scale. Clients came not because we asked, but because they needed reliability again. There were no celebrations, no moment where I stopped and looked back. Just work done the way it was always meant to be done. Every now and then, someone would ask if I felt responsible for what happened. If I thought I should have stepped in, done more, prevented the collapse. I always gave the same answer. I followed every instruction I was given. That was the truth. Because in the end, I didn't take anything from them. I didn't break their system. I didn't destroy their company. I just stopped holding it together. There's something people don't tell you about being indispensable. It doesn't protect you. It just means you understand the system better than the people making decisions about it. And when that system is taken away from you unfairly, the real choice isn't revenge, it's control. Control over your actions, your response, and your boundaries. I didn't fight. I didn't argue. I followed the rules exactly as they were given, and that was enough. What would you have done in my place? Would you have stepped in to save something that pushed you out? Or let it face the consequences it created? If you're still here listening to the very end, I appreciate you more than you think. Stories like this aren't just about one person. They're about anyone who's ever been underestimated, dismissed, or treated like they didn't matter. And if this story made you pause even for a moment, then you're already part of something bigger. Every time you like, comment, or subscribe, you're helping stories like this reach someone who might need it, someone who's still deciding whether to stay silent or stand firm. So if you believe in that, stay with us. This story was fully created and produced by our team. We do not copy or borrow content from any other channel. Thank you for staying with us and listening until the end.